There are some days when I can get pretty cynical about this world that we live in. This often correlates with exactly how much news I have listened to in a given day. Between climate change and escalating inequality in our country and around the world, and the violence caused by both individuals and the state, it can be really hard some days to have any hope for our future. We often talk about the promise of the future, or the promise of a better tomorrow, or the promise of our children. But it can feel at times that that promise has gone stale, that our world can only keep going downhill from here. We worry about the kind of world that we are leaving to our children. And so we have to ask ourselves, as author Chuck Palahniuk has written, when did the future switch from being a promise to being a threat? This country, and in fact our faith, was founded on the idea of progress. The roots of Unitarian Universalism are deeply embedded in that philosophy. There was a time when Unitarian theology was summarized as a belief in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. All of history was seen as an upward journey, at least in Western society, to this moment. And the assumption was that the world would continue to go up. There seemed to be no limits to progress or to what humanity could achieve. This was, in fact, the premise of early humanism in many ways. Back in the 1930s, when the first Humanist Manifesto was written, the notion was that these humanists, many of whom were also Unitarians, had such deep faith in humanity that they assumed that humans could be and would be the source of salvation in this world. They assumed that as long as we worked hard enough at it, someday we would achieve heaven on earth, a utopian society. They emphasized the inherent good in humanity, an emphasis that flew in the face of the Calvinist notion of human depravity. Did you know we came from Calvinists? Maybe? Did you know? I'm curious, actually. No. So the history of our faith begins with Calvinism, and begins, in fact, with a reaction to Calvinism. So it was one of those pendulum-swinging moments in religion. At the peak of Calvinism, the pendulum had been all the way to the side of human depravity. The only reason that the Calvinists, our forebears, didn't fall into despair is that they firmly believed that one day salvation would come and God would wipe them clean of their depravity. So this is what those Puritans who came over to the United States believed. Now, at the peak of 20th century humanism, the pendulum swung all the way to the other side, to the side of goodness, potential, and the promise of humanity. Now, as is often the case, neither of these extremes by itself is a particularly helpful way to view the world. As I'm sure we have all experienced in our lives, people can be both wondrously loving on the one hand and incredibly hateful on the other. We are more complex than simply all good or all evil. Last week we talked about the ways that we make promises and fall short. This is what we are, promise-making and promise-breaking. And so these days, we tend to be a little bit humbler about human potential than our humanist forebears. We aren't always sure that the future will be a bright one. Our optimism is tempered by the actual experience of living in this world. We know that humanity has achieved great things, and that in fact our world is in many ways more just than it once was. But we've also seen the horror of what people and human societies can do to one another. It was really World War II that started to swing the pendulum back away from human goodness and potential. After the horrors of the Holocaust, folks who had been all the way to that side began to realize they had to think again about what humanity was really all about. So today, I like to think that our pendulum has swung somewhere back near the center, although in our faith we tend to be a little more on the side of potential and possibility. Now, there's a lovely little story about an old rabbi who tells his young student that the key to success is to keep your hands in both pockets. This is my favorite part of the sermon because my hands are warm. Since this is rather cryptic advice, the student presses the rabbi to say more about what he means. The rabbi explains that in one pocket he will find a crown because he is a child of God, and in the other pocket he will find dust because from dust he came and to dust he shall return. Now, I translate this story into UU lingo like this. In one pocket, we hold our potential for good. We hold the parts of us that are loving, community building, and justice seeking. In the other pocket, we hold our fallibility, the parts of us that turn to hatred and fear, the parts of us that keep us isolated from one another. And so if we keep our hands in both pockets, we remember that we have both of these potentials within us, that both of these are truths of being human. Now, the challenge for us in all of this is holding both of these truths about humanity, truths that aren't always easy to hold, understanding that we may succeed and we may fail, and that we cannot know for sure, and nonetheless choosing hope, choosing to trust in the possibility that we will indeed build a better world together. This is not necessarily an easy choice. As I said in the beginning, I certainly get cynical sometimes. It's a challenge to choose hope. I hear of yet another school shooting or yet another bill that gets passed to limit the ways we help the least privileged among us. And I wonder if we will ever make any progress towards building that world we dream about. Choosing hope and trusting in possibility really is a matter of faith in many ways. It was Unitarian minister Theodore Parker who first wrote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and my eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." And perhaps we cannot know, right? We cannot know the moral universe. It is too big, too long for us to understand. We cannot know where it ends. But perhaps we can look at the world around us and see the little ways that that arc is bending just slightly, ever so slightly, towards justice. And perhaps those little things can help us trust in the possibility that eventually it will bend itself all the way to that just and peaceful world that we dream about. Back in 2011, when Occupy Wall Street began, my husband was living in New York City. I was still in Boston, but he mentioned it to me offhand in a phone conversation that he was going to a protest against Wall Street. Now, he went to plenty of random little protests, so I didn't think too much of it at the time. The next week, Occupy Wall Street started showing up in the news all over the place. And so a few weeks later, I saw the encampment in Zuccotti Park for myself on a visit to New York. It was a bustling place with a library in one corner and an assembly meeting going on in another corner, and all these tents squished in together on the concrete plaza that one counted as a park in the city. I had two reactions to this little community that was getting big press. There was one part of me that saw great promise in the movement. Here was the kind of organizing and solidarity work that had toppled regimes in Egypt and Tunisia. Here was a popular uprising demanding an end to the increasing economic inequality in our country. This is what community should look like, I thought. This is a prime example of the way we all need to be coming together to build the beloved community. Perhaps, I thought to myself, perhaps this is the beginning of the movement that will save our world. But there was another part of me, the cynical part that said, this is crazy. My inner cynic said, this is never going to work. These people are wasting their time. Who is ever going to listen to a bunch of postmodern hippies camping out in a park? It's a good question, right? Now you'd think, since this was 4 years ago, you'd think that by now it would be clear which part of me was right. Alas, the moral universe just isn't that simple. Now, some of you might say that my inner cynic won out. The occupiers were, after all, thrown out of Zuccotti Park after just a couple of months. And Wall Street certainly hasn't gotten any less powerful. And yet there are other ways in which the Occupy Wall Street movement did exactly what it had set out to do. They changed the conversation that we were having about the economy. They changed the very language that we use to talk about economic inequality. 5 years ago, if I had stood up here and spoken about the 99%, not one of you would have had any sense of what that might mean. Today, it's a part of our common discourse. You hear it on the radio, you read it in the newspaper. It's a way that we talk about economic inequality that wasn't there 5 years ago. We talk about Occupy-style tactics of protesting these days. Even that word, Occupy, has taken on new meanings. You can attach it to anything now, and it will mean something very specific. And the Occupy movement, in fact, did not simply die. It evolved. In the weeks and months after Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, a group called Occupy Sandy sprang up. And to this day, it's the most active recovery group and the group that is most focused on aiding the recovery in working-class neighborhoods. Some would also say that the Occupy movement set the stage for other movements to arise as well, such as Black Lives Matter which has been spreading like wildfire across our country in the last year or so. So perhaps what I witnessed that day in Zuccotti Park was the beginning of a movement that will save our world. We cannot know for sure. Indeed, the arc of the universe is very, very long. But from what I see on my non-cynical days, it seems to be bending towards justice. So in this world of uncertainty, in this time when we cannot know for sure whether the future holds promise or peril, whether it is a promise or a threat, how do we trust in possibility? If we can't promise the progress of mankind onward and upward forever, and we can't promise salvation in an afterlife, where do we then, as Unitarian Universalists, find our faith in the future? Now, one of my hopes is that we can find our faith for the future right here, in our Unitarian Universalist communities. We can find it in loving communities that inspire us to work for a more loving future. We can find it in communities of resistance that inspire us to stand up and fight back. We can find it in communities that show up for one another, inspiring us to show up in solidarity with others. We can find our faith for the future in remembering all the moments and the movements that have reminded us in little ways, once again, that the arc of the universe may be very, very long, but it does seem to be bending towards justice. And when all else fails, perhaps we can find our faith in the future in that little blue engine from our story. If you need to pull out your orders of service again, you can. As we climb up that arc of the moral universe, climb up to the very top of it, the top of that mountain, waiting for that final bend towards justice, perhaps what will keep us going together will be that simple mantra: I think we can. I think we can. I think we can. May it be so.